Pundits are calling the 2020 presidential election one of the most significant electoral contests in American history. Some rank it with the election of 1860 when the nation teetered on the precipice of civil war. Well, today we have a divided electorate, a divided economy, and a devastating pandemic that has spotlighted deep divisions in American society. Perhaps most troubling for our democracy, we are losing faith in our government, a process that has been ongoing for at least a generation. When a survey conducted by Working America, an affiliate of the AFL-CIO prior to the midterm elections of 2018, the survey asked over 4,000 respondents to name an elected official who was fighting for them. The top response was, no one. In 2019, only 17% of Americans trusted the government to do what was right most or all of the time. The loss of faith in our government reflects our loss of faith in each other. In the 2 decades after World War II, we rebuilt a nation scarred by depression and war. Government provided us with the tools to succeed in education, science and technology, civil rights, infrastructure, and medical care. Together, government, corporate America, and individual citizens collaborated to construct a nation and a people, proving that equality, prosperity, and democracy could not only coexist, but could thrive and strengthen each other. What the 2020 election is really about is how we can restore this idea of commonwealth, how government can work for all of the people, and therefore how each of us can work for our country. There already exists a prototype of how we might accomplish this, because we did it during the 2 decades after 1945. Public policy addressed the educational, health, housing, economic, and environmental needs of Americans. In the process, these policies rapidly expanded the middle class and aided government's bottom line. Take the GI Bill, for example. Before World War II, relatively few Americans graduated from college. This changed dramatically when the GI Bill offered the opportunity of a higher education to millions of returning veterans and their families. They, and especially their offspring, would fill the jobs of the emerging post-industrial economy. The GI Bill grew a middle class that gobbled up new consumer products, thus expanding the economy further. It became what I call a virtuous circle. Government funding for education boosted the consumer economy, in turn raising tax revenues, which generated more educational and training programs, which in turn boosted consumer spending, and so on. Post-war government's impact was even more widespread in public health, certainly a concern for us today. Up until the 1940s, when people got sick, there was relatively little doctors could do in terms of medication. By 1956, 80% of the drugs on the market had been developed since the previous decade, as antibiotics accelerated cures and reduced the threat of epidemics. By the 1960s, vaccines to control mumps, measles, and rubella came on the market, the fruits of government-funded research in the 1950s, and add to this the conquest of polio. These advances paid off in longer lives. By 1960, life expectancy had risen to 69.7 years. It was 62.9 years in 1940, just 20 years earlier. Government funding, particularly through the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, generated an array of scientific and technological breakthroughs. We became the world's leading laboratory and a synonym for invention and innovation. These ideas and policies were mainstream in both the Democratic and Republican parties of that era. There was widespread understanding that government's role would change over time as society and the economy became increasingly complex. It was a vision of government as an agile and vigilant champion for its people. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican who led the nation during most of the 1950s, fully endorsed this perspective. His advocacy of civil rights, the undertaking of the largest public works project in American history, the interstate highway system, and his support of federal funding for tuition, research, and development expanded the footprint of the federal government to meet the exigencies of the times. He believed that such interventions were essential for both the elevation of our citizens and our national security during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Yet Eisenhower always considered himself a moderate Republican, following the simple dictum of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who said, quote, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities." Eisenhower understood that the nation of the 19th century was not the America of the 1950s, and what citizens required of their government had changed dramatically. The key phrase in Lincoln's statement was community of people. If the post-war presidents practiced what we call today identity politics, the identity was American, even on civil rights issues. On March 15, 1965, when President Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would be forwarding a voting rights bill to Congress in response to the brutal attacks on voting rights marchers in Selma, Alabama, a week earlier, Johnson framed the issue as a concern for all citizens. He said, quote, "There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. And we are met here tonight as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem." Among the greatest benefits of these post-war measures were a confident people and a confident nation. During the 1956 presidential campaign, the columnists Stuart and Joseph Alsop set out on a cross-country trip to assess the political climate. That President Eisenhower was popular among the voters was hardly a major scoop, but what impressed the Alsops most during their tour was, to quote them, "how nice Americans are." They accounted for the graciousness as a reflection of the people's, quote, "unquestioning confidence in the American future, an innate sense of personal equality, personal dignity, and personal freedom that transcended class and region." It was a confident nation, not only prosperous, but also of broadening inclusiveness. So there were obvious benefits to the post-war measures until the partnership between government and the American people began to fall apart. There were many culprits: an unpopular war, racial violence, the Arab oil embargo, Watergate, campus unrest, and an imploding industrial economy. For a nation that not only survived but thrived after experiencing economic depression and war, these setbacks should not have been so destabilizing. But in a bipartisan effort, our leaders tapped into the national malaise rather than attacking it, and found that dividing Americans and denigrating government paid high political dividends. The result of government bashing was a government that worked very well for the few, but left the many adrift. It was well to say, as Ronald Reagan did in 1986, that, quote, "the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" Or Bill Clinton's celebratory declaration in 1996 that, quote, "the era of big government is over." But it was not quite accurate. Privileged individuals and organizations were very much plugged into federal policy. The rest of us were not. The fallout reflected this imbalance. 90% of Americans have experienced decline or stagnation in their incomes over the past 30 years. Today, according to Nobel laureate economist Joseph Stiglitz, the U.S. has the highest level of income inequality among developed nations and among the lowest levels of upward mobility. This disparity would matter less were it not for the fact that rising college tuition, burgeoning home prices, skyrocketing healthcare costs, and the price of most consumer goods have eroded middle-class savings, middle-class opportunities, and the size of the middle class itself. Corporate concentration, abetted by the weakening of antitrust enforcement, has further exacerbated the price squeeze, stifling something we used to be great at: innovation and invention. Corporate leaders find it more immediately profitable to plow back profits to shareholders rather than to invest in research and development. At the same time, the federal safety net has shredded. As one economist recently noted, quote, "For Americans under the age of 40, the 21st century has resembled one long recession." Once a global leader in providing opportunities for its citizens, the U.S. has fallen far behind the rest of the developed world in supporting families with paid parental leave, early childhood education, and job training programs, particularly in those areas suffering from a transitioning economy. Well, sure, there are other factors beyond public policy creating this crisis, including globalization. But nations like Germany, Sweden, and Denmark, with relatively high public social service costs, have weathered these developments and have prospered without the deep and despairing economic dislocation the U.S. has experienced. Globally, we have slid far down the list of developed nations. According to UNICEF, the U.S. ranks 37th among countries in the well-being of our children. American infants were 76% more likely to die than children in other developed nations. We could mount programs to address these issues for about $100 billion annually, admittedly a prodigious sum. But in the meantime, the lost productivity generated by our neglect of these children amounts to $800 billion annually. We are the only advanced nation without national legislation guaranteeing paid maternity leave, the only advanced nation not to guarantee workers any vacation, paid or unpaid, and the nation with the lowest minimum wage. Yes, labor unions are much weaker in the U.S., but the government has also withdrawn its protection. We live in an era of reduced expectations, and that has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we can fix this. We should be optimistic, guardedly for sure, but optimistic still. Our greatest resource remains our citizens. Politicians have fanned anti-government sentiment not only for political gain, but also to satisfy their financial supporters. Voters know this. In 1964, 29% of voters believed that the government was, quote, run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. By 2013, that was up to 79%. The record is clear. The U.S. has prospered in times of broad government activism. The nation has faltered when it has failed to live up to its people. So what should the parties stress in this election campaign? Two things in particular. First, there are policies that can lift the people and a nation, because many of them have already worked. Second, we do much better individually when we are together. The theme of unity and common purpose should be played heavily in this campaign. The policies that once made Americans great remain the blueprint for our revival. But this is 2020, not 1956. We have moved firmly into a knowledge economy. Our society is more diverse than at any time since 1910. We are defined and divided less by regional differences than by settlements, metropolitan, suburban, small town, and rural environments. The common denominator between then and now, however, must be investment in our people. Infrastructure projects, investments in basic research, the extension of voting rights protections, progressive taxation, environmental investments, enforcement of antitrust laws, affordable higher education, and immigration reform were all policies that prevailed during the 2 decades after the end of the Second World War. They succeeded in forging a more equitable nation by enabling its citizens to succeed. Post-war Americans confronted new social, economic, and global landscapes, as we do. And an active and inclusive government not only eased the transition, but capitalized on it. Presidents Eisenhower and Johnson in particular understood this. We need to do that today, renewing the investments in our citizens as we did a half-century ago. We need an updating, not an upheaval. Add to the post-war agenda family-friendly policies such as paid family leave, and the result will be a nation much better able to compete in the 21st century, as well as to provide a positive legacy for our children and grandchildren. It's a patriotic agenda that puts all Americans first and preserves our patrimony. It is neither a conservative nor a liberal agenda. It is a common-sense program, literally tried and true to make Americans great again. Can we afford it? Somehow, in a much less affluent nation, following the greatest economic depression in our history and the enormous costs of fighting a world war, we did all of these things and more. Now, in a wealthier country with a better educated population, we ought to be doing even better. And that will generate a common purpose. Our post-war presidents followed a key principle laid down by our first president, George Washington, in his farewell address. Citizens, Washington noted, must, quote, indignantly frown upon the first dawning of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. Our nation's motto, after all, is E pluribus unum. Out of many, one.